months ago, I did a video about how to use a wood-turning chuck, because it occurred to me that a lot of new wood-turners didn't exactly understand what these things were for. So I turned a couple of bowls using one of these, and I showed all of its different functions. And one of the things I said in that video was that a chuck is kind of basically a convenience tool. You don't actually need one to turn bowls on your lathe. And a lot of people watched that video and they liked it, and in the comments a lot of people said, well Rex, if you don't actually need a chuck to turn a bowl, how about you show us how to do it without one? And you know what? That's a good idea. The reason that chucks are kind of unnecessary in turning is your lathe probably came with this thing. It's called a faceplate. It is a solid chunk of metal, usually cast iron. It screws directly to the spindle of your lathe, and then there's holes in it, and you can run screws through this thing into whatever thing that you're turning. Now, compared to chucks, faceplates are a little bit less flexible and a little bit slower and less convenient. But they do offer much better hold because you're typically using good strong wood screws to secure your stuff to the lathe. I've been turning for a long time and I have lost several pieces out of chucks, and they have gone bouncing all around the shop and occasionally right into my head. Face shield! But that has never happened to me when I'm using a faceplate. Things just don't come off of it. So I'm going to demonstrate how to use a faceplate to turn an entire bowl, and to show you how useful this tool can be, I'm going to sort of do the biggest, most ambitious bowl that I can do. I recently got a bunch of apple wood, which has beautiful color, and I'm going to make a bowl out of this large crotch section of the tree. It should have fantastic grain, and maybe I'll get to do a really interesting live edge. First thing I'm going to do is prep the blank. I use this cheap $40 Harbor Freight chainsaw for that. It is really all you need for basic stock preparation of green lumber. Once I've got the section that I want, I put it in my vise and I flip it around looking for a nice flat spot. If there's no flat spot on the work you want to turn, you can just plane one with a hand plane. Especially with soft green wood like this, it goes very quickly. It's not difficult. But I got lucky on this piece and I've got a good flat spot. So I get my faceplate on it, spend a little time getting it carefully centered side to side so I lose as little wood as possible during the turning process, and then I screw it onto my turning blank using some strong coated deck screws. I'm using the inner holes on my faceplate because I'd like my screw holes to be as close together as possible. That means the holes will get turned away when I hollow the bowl out. And because this is wet green wood, there's no need for pilot holes. I just run the screws straight in with an impact driver. If I was using a piece of kiln-dried wood, I would definitely pre-drill the holes first. Next, I got the piece mounted up to the lathe and made a small adjustment to the other side. I just used a handsaw. It was very simple, did it right on the lathe. Then I was able to take a hand drill with a Forstner bit and drill a small hole in the opposite end, and then bring in the tailstock and tighten that up. That's going to give me extra security while I'm roughing out this big blank of wood. Once I get the piece of wood spinning, it looks okay, but there is some vibration. There is actually kind of a lot of vibration. I really need a bigger, heavier duty lathe. But the vibration is tolerable, and at the slowest possible speed, I rough out the exterior of the bowl, and then I start working on getting the exterior shape that I want. Once I've got the bowl roughed and basically shaped, I can pull away the tailstock and start working on the bottom of the bowl. At this point, it's important to understand that the part with the faceplate in it, that's going to be the top of the bowl, the rim. And the part that's facing towards the tailstock, that's going to end up being the bottom of the bowl. And you need a flat spot on there so that you can flip the thing around and reattach it to the lathe. The bottom of this piece is very rough. It's got a bunch of soft, wet bark that I can just peel off with my bare hands and a super wavy surface. I've got to turn all of that away. So I get it squared up, and then I realize that it's still really uneven and there's a lot of soft wood there. I also don't like the proportions of the bowl the way it is. It's a little bit too tall. So I take my parting tool and take off about an inch of wood. Now I like things a lot better, and I'm down to solid heartwood, which is going to give me a much better surface. So I flatten that out again with pull cuts from my gouge, and I finish it off by using the skew chisel. The skew is really helpful for getting flat surfaces because the skew itself is flat, and that does make things very easy. Now that I've got the bowl mostly shaped and the foot flattened, it's time to take it off the lathe, flip it around, and remount it for hollowing. Obviously, I could just take the piece and screw that bottom foot that I made directly to the faceplate. But that would be stupid, because then I would have big long screws sticking right into the piece that I'm trying to turn, and when I took the screws out later, I would have ugly screw holes on the bottom of my work. And that just makes your stuff look amateurish. What we're going to do instead is screw a waste block of wood to the faceplate and then glue our bowl to that waste block. This is often called a glue block. It's a very common technique among turners. I'm going to grab a block of wood. Doesn't really matter what you use, but I'm going with a hardwood in this case. I'll cut it round on the bandsaw, screw it to the faceplate using shorter screws this time, put it on the lathe, and true it up. Now, actually attaching the bowl back onto that faceplate is easier if the foot of the bowl and the faceplate are the same diameter. So I measured that earlier, drew on that circle, and I've turned it down to that exact diameter. They're going to match up really nicely, and that's going to make remounting very painless. I've used this glue block technique many times before, and I've usually glued the waste block on with either Titebond, wood glue, or epoxy, but both of those have to dry overnight, which can be kind of inconvenient when you're in the middle of a project. This time, I am going to use hot glue. I just got this hot glue gun today, and hilariously, I have never used one before. I know, it's like the most common tool in the entire maker universe, and I have literally never even touched one before right this second. This one was cheap on Amazon, and it had the best reviews. I will put a link down in the description. It is absolutely idiot-proof to use. You plug it in, you jam the plastic thing in the back, you let it heat up for 2 minutes, and then you squeeze the hot snot onto whatever you're using. I'll give you one tip on using these that I learned the hard way, which is that if you don't like the way something is on there, you cannot reposition it. I jammed my bowl onto my glue block, and I didn't like the way it was, so I thought I'd pull it off and put it back on again, and the glue immediately cooled off and cured, and the bowl wouldn't stick, which if I had thought about it for a second would have been totally obvious. So I scraped all the glue off, reapplied it, stuck the bowl back on there, and then I brought up the tailstock and tightened that down, and that's basically my clamp. I waited 2 minutes, the thing was rock solid, and I was ready to get back to turning. Now, once you've got your bowl remounted to that glue block, it's not going to be 100% perfectly spinning true. You're going to have to re-true the outside. Mine was very, very close, so rather than busting out the gouge again, I just used a round nose scraper and took a very, very light finishing cut off the whole piece, and that got it spinning perfectly true again. At this point, I pulled away the tailstock and I was ready to start hollowing. This was completely straightforward, just like if I was doing it with a chuck. I went slowly and carefully and tried to maintain a nice even shape the whole way down. Once all the hollowing and shaping is done, it's time to get that bowl off the lathe. And you do that by parting it off the glue block with your diamond parting tool. You get it most of the way there, and then you just cut through the last inch or inch and a half of glue block with a fine tooth saw. Here's how I do it. I usually make 2 cuts, one of them in the bowl itself, and that's going to give me my surface on the bottom, and then another cut in the waste block, and that's going to give me some clearance. After I've got both of those cuts fairly deep in, I angle the parting tool just a couple of degrees and start working it in while it's pointing up a little bit towards the rim of the bowl. That's going to make the underside of that bowl a little bit hollow. It's going to help it sit flat on a table and make it easier to clean up when I'm done. So I have that parting tool in at a slight angle, I'm slowly working it in, working that tenon down, and this is where I lost the bowl straight off the lathe. Nothing broke, it's just that the glue joint failed. You can see it right here. And right now, you're probably saying to yourself, wait a second, Rex, that's not hot glue, that's Titebond. And you're 100% right. Let me go back a second. I was just not happy with the way that the hot glue was working on this piece. It was just not sticking very well. I was getting some wobble in the lathe. I didn't like it. So I yanked the bowl off, scraped off all the hot glue, and just redid the whole thing with Titebond 3. I think it could be because this bowl is a little bit wet that it wasn't holding very well. Because I glued together these dry scraps of oak like 3 days ago with the hot glue gun, and they are stuck together like iron. So I just don't think hot glue works very well for heavy, wet, cold pieces of wood. Time like this, Titebond works better. And the mistake I made is I didn't give the joint very much time to dry, only about 10 hours, and especially with a wet piece of wood, that probably wasn't enough. I also got more aggressive with the parting tool than I usually do. I typically stop sooner and switch over to the handsaw. So if you're more patient than I was and have a lighter touch with the tool, this will not happen to you. Your glue block will be fine and your piece will come off gracefully. Luckily, the bowl was mostly undamaged by its fall. It had a couple little chips around the rim, but a tiny bit of super glue and a little bit of sanding, and everything still looks nice and natural. Now that I've got the bowl off the lathe, the next thing is to clean up the bottom, where it's all ragged from the parting tool. Now, if I were using a standard bowl and chuck, I would flip this thing around and grab it in a set of cold jaws on the rim. But this is a live edge bowl, which means it's all ragged around the edge and there's nowhere for the cold jaws to grip it anyway. So even if I had a standard chuck, it wouldn't do me any good for finishing the bottom of this bowl. What I'm going to do instead is make a thing called a jamb chuck. It's very simple. I go over to the lathe, take the waste block off the faceplate, and screw on this big chunk of construction 4x4. I keep this around just for making jamb chucks, and I turn it to whatever shape I need for whatever bowl I'm working on. The inside bottom of this bowl is quite flat, so I'm going to turn a flat surface on the end of the 4x4, and then I'll quickly turn the outside just to true it up and get it spinning without any vibration. Then I'll take a piece of yoga mat and a bowl and just jam the whole thing right over the hunk of 4x4. This is why it's called the jamb chuck, because you just jam everything together. Then I'll bring up the tailstock, add a little tension with that, and it's held surprisingly firmly. You might be a little dubious about this the first time you try it, but this is a very long-standing traditional turner's trick. Works just fine. Now, one problem you might have is getting the bowl really centered so that it spins true. And there's an easy trick for that. Just take a regular pencil, put it on the tool rest, and put the lead so it's just touching the bowl. Then rotate that bowl by hand. What'll happen is that pencil lead will graze the bowl just where it's sticking out past its axis of rotation a tiny bit. You'll get a mark there, and then you won't get a mark where the bowl is shifted inward a little bit. And what happened with this one is the same thing that happens with all of these bowls. I've got a pencil mark that goes about halfway around the bowl, which means it's a little bit shifted to one side. I'll rotate that mark so that it's on the top of the bowl. That means the part that's sticking out is straight up. I give that a couple of quick taps with a soft mallet, retighten the tailstock, and now the bowl is spinning perfectly true. I can go in there with a bowl gouge and clean up everything that's left over from the parting operation and get a flat, clean bottom to the bowl. After that's done, I've still got a little nib where the tailstock was, and I couldn't reach it with the tool. I go in there with the standard woodworking chisel and just pare that off. So this bowl is completely turned, and it's about 90% done. Now this is green, wet wood, so it's going to need to be dried, finish sanded, and it's going to need a finish. Probably an oil, something that's really going to bring out all the grain that I got from turning this crotch wood. If you're interested in that process, I have a whole video about turning green wood bowls, and you can learn everything about how I finish them and dry them in that video. And if you haven't done a project like this, or if you're not even a turner yet, you might want to read my book, 1 Week to Wood Turning. It's your complete guide to all the gear of wood turning. And I cover everything, like bowl gouges, scrapers, face plates, chucks, lathes, all of it. It's everything you need to get started. If you're interested in more information, go over to rexkruger.com/book. While you're at my website, you might want to go over to the store, where I've got t-shirts, hoodies, and plans, including the plan I just put out for my $30 vise that I added to my low workbench. This is a real English pattern face vise that you honestly can build for 30 bucks entirely with hand tools in about a day. Before I go, I have to always mention my patrons, because no matter how many plans I sell, it's never really going to cover the cost of making these videos. Patreon and my supporters are what get that done for me. So if you're interested in supporting independent, unbiased, unsponsored DIY videos like this one, go over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out all the exclusives and rewards that I have just for my patrons. And before I go, I know that I've added some new international viewers, and I owe you guys flags. I know I do, but I cannot find my flags right this second. They are around here somewhere. I promise I will find them this week and get those flags up there. So follow me on Instagram @RexKruger, and you can check out the progress I make at updating my flag board. And as usual, I super appreciate having viewers for my videos. Thanks so much for watching.